Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And today, now that we've got our shortlist for the Booker, I'm going to talk a little bit about it here. I couldn't react to it live when it came out because I was on holiday and I think originally I thought the dates were slightly different. So I was like, oh, it's great, I'm going to record a sort of reaction to it and then go on holiday. No, that did not work out. And I sort of had this moment of being like, could I just do it from my hotel? And I was like, no, I think that's probably not the vibe. Anyway, let's get talking about this year's shortlist for the Booker Prize. And I think it's an interesting one in several ways. It's a long list that seems to have had a bit of controversy, feels too strong a word, but kind of discourse about it in terms of some people who have really enjoyed the long list as a whole, some people who have just found it really lacking. And not to kind of completely fence it here, I think I'm somewhere in the middle. There are definitely some books that I think that I would have loved to have seen on the long list, and I've spoken about those several times. But I also think that there are some real gems on this list, and I think from that long list into the short list, I think there are some core parts that come out thematically as well. And I did a separate video talking just about the long list and trying to predict what shortlist I thought might come, or at least my sort of preferred shortlist. I was way off. This is very, very different, but there are a few books on this shortlist that I really greatly enjoyed and was hoping to see there. So all is not lost in that respect. I think thematically for the Booker this year, this shortlist makes a lot of sense. Some of the books that are on this are particularly around some of these core themes or the kind of general spirit. I suppose the thing that I'm in some ways most surprised about is some of the more kind of dreamlike, less sort of plotty books actually all made it. So Orbital, for example, and Creation Lake and Held. I didn't think that necessarily all three of them would make it in. Particularly alongside something like Safekeep or whatever, where there's a sort of slightly open-endedness to some of the ways that the books are written. So that's kind of a surprise in some ways, but also a really interesting list in many ways as well. The most women that we've ever had on a shortlist at 5, and I think it was already a long list with, I want to say, 9 women. So to some degree, numbers-wise, that makes sense. Although I will sort of say that personally, 2 of my favourite books from this year's list, My Friends by Hisham Attar and Playground by Richard Powers, both didn't make it. But I think regardless, this is an interesting shortlist. So let's get on speaking a bit about them. I'm going to sort of do a broad review of them, of each book, and then at the end come to sort of my personal picks for the win as well. So with that in mind, let's get started. Also, apologies in advance. I've literally got quite a lot of light coming at me, and so if it looks like I'm squinting or I'm angry at the camera, it's literally just anyway, going first alphabetically, we have the one man on the shortlist, Percival Everett, with James. And in many ways, this was the book that I think was the sort of dead cert for the shortlist. Obviously, nothing is completely set in stone, but this is the book that I think had the most appeal to so many people. It's the book that I think has been best received from what I've seen on the long list. And it's also just a book that I think really deserves the kind of a place in so many literary prizes. It's a very good book for that kind of thing, and just a very good book in general. So this is a book that takes the story of Huckleberry Finn as its sort of, I want to say inspiration, but in many ways this book is a reaction to or a response to to Huckleberry Finn. And it particularly takes some of the core ideas from Huckleberry Finn and the kind of core story plot points and flips them, or at least kind of reimagines parts of it. So in the original Huckleberry Finn, there is the character Jim, who's an enslaved man who is, for many parts of the book, this sort of hidden figure. He is sort of specifically, the characters are trying to stop him from being caught and kind of re-enslaved or kind of taken away. He is also a figure who is, he sort of falls into many of the kind of stereotypes, I guess, or kind of images of African-American people at the time. So he is sort of, as much as he's seen as a very beloved character and he's full of this warmth, he isn't really able to read and write. He's sort of the kind of folksy charm almost of the book. And so what I think Percival Everett does really well here in his kind of very sort of trademark writing style is not only reimagines him, but also adds this sort of touch of barbed humor to what happens here. So Jim is now James, and James is a more rounded character who is able to read and write, but hides that from other people lest they feel threatened. He is, in many ways, the kind of brains of the operation. He's doing quite a lot in the background to move things forward, plot-wise, and just sort of generally to support other people. He's almost more than able to protect himself, but he watches how Huckleberry Finn almost takes on a sort of slightly white savior character kind of position in this book. He's also just this really funny character because of this sort of duality, because he has to present as the kind of folksy, charming kind of stereotype or kind of caricature that every other character expects. Because of that, he is able to have almost this private inner world that we as the reader get to experience. And in that inner world, he talks a lot about, looking at some of the plot points of things that are happening. So looking at Huckleberry Finn, for example, dressing up as a woman to try and trick someone. And in his inner monologue is just like, will this boy never learn? This is never going to work. And lo and behold, it doesn't. And so I think he plays this sort of comical character, but at the same time, there's something really pressing about the way this book does this. There's a real intelligence and heart to it that really focuses on wider conversations about the ways that traditional and kind of more classic US stories often focus on the white guy as the savior, or how so many of these other stories really position certain characters to do certain things. And in many ways it's a subversion of all of that, but also tells a more modern story. And so for that reason I think this book is excellent, and I also would not be surprised to see it win. It feels like it's a very current and very well crafted book as well. Next up, we have Samantha Harvey with Orbital, and I'm very glad to see this book on the list. I think this has not been to everyone's tastes. It's worth saying. Some people seem to have absolutely loved it. Some people have really just not gotten on with it. And I see that. I get that. It's a very dreamlike book in many ways. The core idea is a group of astronauts, basically sent up to to be part of these sort of various satellites going around the Earth. And in the course of the 150 or so pages, these characters have these meditations on what it means to be human, what it means to think of home, what it means to be from a nation, because many of the characters are from these different countries, and so there's this kind of odd international cooperation up in the skies, or in the up in space, that doesn't necessarily happen on Earth. And at the same time, these characters are meditating on things around death and life itself, because many of them have taken part in a journey that might not ever return them back to Earth, either because of them dying in a kind of an accident, or because the orbit or everything will take place for so long that they might never return. And the book does deal with this sense of time in a really interesting way. The chapters are basically these little orbits, and so we learn of these characters going through these various periods of time and the way they think about things. And there are these lists, and there's this kind of almost attempt to categorize and compartmentalize and kind of make practical something that is so abstract. This idea of what life is being morphed and transformed into these little words and lists and routines and things like that. And there's something that really unravels throughout the book about what it really means to be human instead. And I think that's what I found so captivating about this book, is it's very short and focused, but has this really dreamlike quality that allows you to kind of be part of this little voyage of something that's so different and so outside of what we would typically all know. And I think I just really enjoyed the humanity of it. I think it's a really well crafted book, and it shouldn't work almost. We shouldn't necessarily in any other book kind of care about these little lists or whatever. And I know some people's objection to the book has been they just didn't care, and I get that. but there's something for me that was really hypnotic about the way this book creates this sort of time outside of time. And I really greatly enjoyed it. I think this is a really beautiful and pensive novel. Next up, we have Rachel Kushner with Creation Lake. And this is a book I did solo reviews for all of them apart from one, which I'll talk about in a sec. And Creation Lake was one I really struggled with. The overall idea of the book I like. I kind of wanted to like this slightly more, but I struggled a little bit. So the core idea is we have a young woman called Sadie Smith, which still I think is kind of hilarious in its own way of just sort of basically being an author's name, whilst also being a kind of, ooh, I'm an undercover character that nobody will suspect this name kind of thing. There's a fun little nod there. And she is an undercover spy, for want of a better word, really. And part of this is understanding and trying to subvert the actions of a group of activists who are sort of seen as potential sort of eco-terrorists or whatever, who particularly have set their sights on some of the political figures in France. And so she is this figure who kind of comes in from the outside and tries to pretend like she's being part of all of their activities with a goal that she's going to feed this information back. There's also this kind of other, I wouldn't say necessarily plot, but kind of, to some degree, a plot of her reading these emails from this kind of cult leader or whatever of this group called Bruno, and his meditations on various things, including Neanderthals and what it means to be human and all these other things. And some of those I think I found really interesting, and the spy part I found really interesting. But I think as the book went on, and I kind of feel it went on a little bit too long personally, there's a bit towards the end where I think this book then deals with what that then looks like and tries to subvert some of the typical plot points and story points of a book like this. And that I don't mind as such. I love a bit of subversion within a kind of trope. I think for me that the disappointing thing is that I think the subversion leaves this book, for me at least, feeling like it was all an exercise in just thinking about some things for a bit. And then kind of ends. And I realised the kind of irony of me saying this about this being a thing I didn't get on well with for Creation Lake, but that I loved about Orbital. I don't quite know sometimes how to square that circle, that for me Orbital is this kind of dreamlike thing that makes its points and then leaves, and Creation Lake I feel has this sense of where it wants to go and the points it wants to make and then kind of ducks out at the end. And I think that's for me the part that I found tricky about this book, is it feels like it sort of, through trying to subvert some of the tropes, also kind of undermines its own message. I mean, I will say overall it was still an enjoyable read. Sometimes I've had books like this where I've just wanted to throw it across the room, and this wasn't that. I really enjoyed the process of reading it. I found it interesting, I found it engaging. I think it has a lot to say. It's just I struggled personally with the kind of the way this book kind of addressed its points at the end and how it tries to round things off. However, that said, I think there is still something really fascinating about the ways that this book uses ideas around cults or ideas around sort of past histories to try and construct a wider narrative, and particularly a wider narrative that is about something slightly bombastic. And particularly the end of this book has these really funny, bizarre moments that I really enjoyed. So yeah, it's a mixed bag for me, and I totally see why people could love this. I think for me, it just, I feel like it kind of fumbled the bag at the end, but there we go. We move on. Next up, we have Held by Anne Michaels. And this is the book that I mentioned that I have not yet done a solo review for. And it's not because I didn't like the book. I think it's just one of those books I read, I think earlier in the year, probably about February or March or something. And I genuinely struggled to remember parts of it. And I've been trying to kind of watch other people's videos talking about it, or to kind of read bits of reviews, or even kind of look back at what I said at the time in my video just after I'd read it. And I think that is kind of part of its both charm and kind of where some of the detractors have been kind of coming from about this book, is it's very, I've heard people just describe it as vibes. And in many ways it is kind of that. It's a book that's very poetic and sort of meandering. I'm currently reading Fugitive Pieces by the same author, and I am remembering the style of Held because there's this very kind of meandering lyrical style where you're told a detail and you're told three different things that it sounds like or feels like, and in that sense her writing is very sensuous and very tangible almost. And I think I want to say that she's a poet outside of writing novels as well, which makes sense. And so I think this book I found an odd one to sort of think about in the list, and I was sort of surprised initially to see it in the long list, and to some degree surprised to see it in the short list. But people who do love it seem to really love it, so actually this makes sense. The core idea of this book, after about a minute and a half of me rambling, is this soldier sort of at the point of potentially dying, looking over, sort of meditating on life and thinking. In some ways, again, this is a book that is then slightly, not plotless, but it's less about a kind of hitting certain plot points and going somewhere. And again, something I typically really enjoy. I love books that kind of meander and flow in certain ways. For some reason, this didn't fully work for me. There are parts of this I found really beautiful. But there's something about the kind of the artistic style of this that is both really captivating and for me slightly frustrating, because at times, although it's quite a short book, there are sort of times where I was like, okay, great, I think we kind of get this feeling now. Let's sort of move on to something else. And it almost sometimes feels like there's sort of something stuck where the author is like, no, you need to know the exact way this thing feels. And some part of me really appreciates that. There's a kind of specificity to the book that is really captivating. At the same time, I think this is why I found it really difficult to think about doing a solo review for it, because the more I went to sort of try and record it, I would sort of just think, well, it's kind of just about this sort of feeling, and I don't quite know how to articulate that. In some ways, the book itself has to be that experience, right? Because it is so specific and so focused in trying to convey a specific type of feeling. So yeah, it's a weird one. I can't fully tell how I feel about it. But then now with reading Fugitive Pieces, I kind of see the appeal again. There's this sort of whirling kind of free fall of memory in that book that was in Held that is really interesting in its own way as well. Next up, we have The Safekeep by Yael van der Wouden. And this book I didn't necessarily enjoy too much when I first read it, but I've slowly come to think about it more and more. And so I realize this is a list where there are a lot of very kind of floaty novels. And I don't mean that as a disparaging remark. I think there's something about the kind of pensiveness of these books that's really interesting. And I think in something like The Safekeep, it does it in a very interesting way, I think. We are basically told we're presented with the book in three parts. The first part is a more focused narrative about sort of early days of a sort of young woman in her life, and she's this sort of quite complex figure. We move to a second part of her life where some big life moments happen and she changes up some things. Particularly there's this kind of searing, dramatic relationship at the heart of this part. And then we go into the third part that in many ways deals with a sort of historical reckoning of something that in many ways has been hiding in plain sight for the whole novel. And I think this is a really interesting way. Although that third part didn't necessarily work for me as much, the more I've stopped and thought about it after reading it, the more I actually do think this book does some really engaging and really interesting things. I think particularly by having history be this kind of underlying thing in the book, there's something really tense constantly throughout, where to some degree there are almost these red herrings of kind of, we're talking about the 1960s in the Netherlands. And so the characters are sort of presented as being just far away enough from World War II that that's not really a shadow that lingers as much anymore. But actually, as we read more and more of the book, we understand exactly how that is part of it. And we also understand the kind of other parts of power that are at play in the novel. So around Jewishness and around a property and what that property might show or tell in various other ways. And it reminded me a little bit of Jenny Erpenbeck's book, the title of which I've now entirely forgotten. The German is Heimsuchung. I will mention it below when I think about it. And the Visitation? No, something like that. But that book also deals with this idea of history being sort of buried below levels of sediment, both in terms of physical items, but the ways that memories are sort of pressed down and pushed down and not thought about until later. And I think this book does something really interesting with that, in that the characters are suppressing so much that it kind of bubbles up every so often. Particularly the sort of central character is so tense and fussy at early parts of the book, and very sort of specific. We sort of very particular character, very strong flavour. And so we come to get the feeling later that she is, as these things sort of explode and bubble up out of her, there's a sort of a way that this book is kind of engaging with that shows that almost there is, you know, how much of this has been the way she was raised by people post World War II. You know, how much can we look at this sort of contextually, that some characters would come out of a situation like this with these sorts of neuroses, whether that is directly having experienced it or having been raised by people who experienced it and had that to some degree passed on. So I think this book does a lot more than I initially gave it credit for. And I think particularly Alyssa's video, The Nerdy Nurse, I will link to her video, because I think she does such an exceptional job of describing the joys of this book that I didn't get at first, and after I heard her talk about it, thought a little bit differently about this book as well. And last but not least, Stone Yard Devotional by Charlotte Wood. And this is one of my favourites on the list, actually. I'm really glad to see this book here. So Stone Yard Devotional takes as its core idea a woman who is escaping some parts of her history to some degree. She moves to a sort of retreat or kind of convent style sort of place, and a big part of her sort of journey, both sort of in day-to-day life and kind of her internal journey throughout the story, is around atonement and this idea of being forgiven. And so it kind of manifests in these really interesting ways, where she is holding on to these memories of things from years back, and every other character around her is kind of like, oh, like, don't worry about it, that's like nothing, or I can barely remember that. But she is thinking about those things. She's also this interesting figure because she is she's feeling all of these feelings, but also to some degree is almost focusing on some of the wrong things, right? We get a sense throughout parts of the book that she has also let other people down, or, you know, there's a small section where she talks about when she went to go to this retreat, she didn't tell anybody, and so people are really worried, and she's having to sort of message them and be like, oh my god, what's the deal with this? Why are you so frustrated about it? And not able to see that, but able to see the pain from someone from 30 years ago, right? There's this kind of mismatch in how she perceives things. And there's something really unnerving about this book in a very quiet way. So much of the book is done through these sorts of observations and glances and confessions and these small conversations or hints of a conversation that happen. And kind of through that, we piece together some of the things about her life and her history. And I found it so utterly captivating for the way that this tone, I think, throughout is so sparse, and it does feel like we are sort of a very slow moving camera just sort of rotating around things near her, even though so much of this is also in her own head, as in we're hearing her thoughts and her perceptions of things. But there's a very tight focus to so much of this book that feels very much like we are stepping into the confession booth with her and letting her unspool all of these thoughts and all of this sense of guilt and this frustration and everything else. And I just found her such an interesting character, that she is this, she's seeking redemption and seeking not even justice. She almost wants to sort of throw herself upon the fire to kind of cleanse herself of these things. meanwhile, she is this, we kind of get a sense sometimes that she is both culpable of some things, but also hasn't even realized the things that she is to blame for. She has this odd sense of justice, and she's almost not fully unreliable, I think, but there are some degrees of her memory being quite unreliable, or her perceptions of things being unreliable, that we are meant to see some of the ways she talks about things as slightly missing the point, and we're able to read between the lines. And I found her utterly captivating as a character for that reason. And I think this book is so well crafted to focus in on those little areas. So yeah, this is, I think, a great book and one of my personal favorites from this long list. So those are all of the 6 books shortlisted for this prize. And kind of like I said earlier, it's kind of interesting that this is such a floaty, I can't think of a better word for it than floaty at the moment. A better one will come to me. It's not fully exact for what I want to say, but there is a kind of dreamlike quality to so many of these books, where they move, the sense of time moves really intriguingly in these books. I think to some degree, James is the most straight down the line, typical storytelling one. And even that is a bit sort of bonkers and off the wall at times. But particularly there are kind of a lot of very quiet, thoughtful, reflective, pensive books on this list that have this very dreamlike feel. So like Orbital and Held and the Safekeep, I think particularly, and Stone Yard Devotional to some degree, have this very kind of really sort of drifting kind of feel to them. There's this sort of, these meandering sentences that seem at first like they're not really about anything in particular, but contain within them a lot more that's going on. The same for something like Creation Lake, where a lot of the pieces are kind of being moved behind the scenes so we can't see them. And then suddenly something changes and we realize that this has been in front of us the entire time. And I think it's a really remarkable achievement, particularly for some of these books, I think, to kind of do this, to kind of construct these narratives that can be so sort of, to some degree, cut off from typical time that we would see in books, or from big plot points or whatever, and instead deliver these very thoughtful meditations on something. And, you know, although I think some books do this more effectively than others, you know, I think, obviously, as I mentioned, Orbital and Stone Yard Devotional were 2 of the books that I was hoping would make the list anyway. And those books, I think, take that way of approaching a timelessness within the novel, the kind of lack of time of what seems to be happening, and do that really profoundly. I think there's something really special about both books and the way they do that. There's something really interesting still about, you know, the other 3 books by women on this list, so Held, The Safekeep, and Creation Lake, in the way that they also have a thesis at the heart of what they're talking about, and deliver it through these sort of slightly dreamlike, or slightly what appear at first to be sort of unfocused narratives, and sort of do something else in the background instead. I think James is a really interesting counterpoint to some of these books, that it's, as much as it, is sort of more traditional in terms of a plot kind of book, it also is really seeking to make specific points, and does so often in this really unsettling and jarring way, but in a really brilliant way, I think, by having these harsh realities set up against sort of comedy and absurdity, to the extent where we are engaging with some really tricky concepts and some really uncomfortable realities of history, but we're doing so through the kind of bombastic quality of something happening in a book. And I think that there's something really special about all of these. All of this is a very long way of me trying to pin down my favourites. And although I have my 3 favourites already that I was kind of hoping for going into this list, so James, Orbital, and Stone Yard Devotional, I'm intrigued by the inclusion of the other 3, which are not ones that I'd necessarily have personally chosen, but I see how they slot in alongside the rest of the books in this list. There's a real kind of dreamlike quality to this, and in some ways a book like Enlightenment that didn't make the list, I see how it fits alongside these. There's this sort of very spectral, I don't know if that's the right word, but kind of there's sort of odd quality to these books that sort of dances around. In many ways would be happy for, obviously, the three I like to win. The Safekeep, I can see a really strong argument for it winning. I think I'd struggle a little bit more personally with Held and with Creation Lake, just because I don't think I personally got on with those books quite as well. And at least they've not lingered in quite the same way. I don't know if the points that they're trying to make as their core thesis necessarily land, or at least didn't land for me. But regardless, here is our shortlist, and we will find out in a few weeks who the winner is. I'd love to hear your thoughts too. Are there any books that you're particularly, rooting for, that you'd love to see win? We've had quite a few male winners in a row, and so the optics of James winning against 5 women is a bit, but at the same time, I personally, of the list, I think between Stoneyard Devotional and James, those are my 2 favourite books on this list. I think Orbital is incredibly strong as well, and so I'd love to see one of them win. But really, given the sort of surprises in this long list, and to some degree the surprises for me, at least personally, with the shortlist, I am really struggling to work out who would actually win. It's a really open field, I think, in that respect, because particularly 5 of these books, and I suppose maybe taking Stoneyard Devotional out of those, 4 of these books share a lot of very similar qualities of being these very dreamlike, slow, quiet, reflective, pensive books. And so I wonder what that will look like when, what that will look like when it comes to judging, whether those books will cancel each other out to some degree, and that will make James stand out more, whether James will seem too much given the kind of quiet reflectiveness of some of these other books. Who knows? That kind of bombastic quality of James is so appealing, but I can see if you've just read sort of 5 other books that are a lot slower and more reflective, maybe that book feels different. So there we go. When the Booker judges read these books for the 3rd time to choose their winner, maybe something new will come out of these books as well. Anyway, I hope you're doing really well. Take care, and I'd love to hear your thoughts for who you're rooting for. Speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.